This podcast would not be possible without the wonderful people who back me on my Patreon page. You can reach out, and if you go to patreon.com, look for Set Lusting Bruce, and you can support the podcast for as little as $1 a month. When you support it, you get unedited episodes, random blogs from me, and you get a happiness in your heart that you're helping me share the gospel of music and Springsteen throughout the world. I want to thank Paul Appleton, Amy Brooks, David Kosiskas, C.K. Westbrook, Sean Poole, David and Jennifer Edwards, David and Jennifer Von Edwards, Jeff Omer, Sylvian Groth, Liz Bronson, Yetta, Steve Vansack, John Munson, Betsy Hodges, Levi Petrie, Elizabeth Brunson, Stephen Malio, Steve Rogers, aka Captain America, Dale Hosack, Terry Smith, Chris Bloom, and Mary Thomas. Thank you guys. You are the best. And now let's go on to the episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Set Lusting Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson. We are getting off the Bruce train, though he's going to come up as he often does. I have my new friend, David Miller, joining us. David, welcome to the podcast.
Nice to talk to you, Jesse.
Tell us about yourself.
I am a multimedia artist and educator. I live in Los Angeles. I'm originally from Omaha, Nebraska, and grew up there, got interested in photography after seeing an exhibit by Sebastian Salgado, who is a very humanist photographer in a lot of ways. He's equivalent of your Bruce Springsteen or U2 or Midnight Oil, that kind of what they were doing with their socially conscious lyrics is what Sebastian Salgado did with his photography.
Wow.
After living in Nebraska the early 2 decades of my life, I moved to Phoenix, Arizona for 20 years and did my photography stuff there, got into animation and filmmaking as all those tools became more available to us when Adobe basically forced everybody to learn these things if they want to use their photo tools. And now I live in Los Angeles.
How old were you when you saw that art exhibit that spoke to you?
I was 19, so I was always into arts, but I had most people get into the arts through illustration. And I was born in 77. And so the era I grew up in was definitely Star Wars, Spielberg, the Muppets, all that imaginative stuff.
Yeah.
And I thought I wanted to work for the Creature Workshop in London and make Muppets as a little kid. Either that or I wanted to be a film director.
Hmm.
And I went to a graphic design school when I got out of high school, and I said, I'm not making these cereal boxes. I don't
Yeah.
care about this stuff. And my personality is INFP, and we could say like Bruce is an EFP, but intuitive feeling people who are very empathetic and want to make something out of their lives that's meaningful. And so commercial art didn't really particularly appeal to me, but stuff that told the stories of migrants and workers, which is what Sebastian Salgado's primary photographic subject matter was in that era. He didn't commit the genocide in Rwanda, but he photographed it in the 90s. And then he kind of lost his taste for working around like humanist themes. He just lost all faith in humanity. And since then, he's probably in his 80s now, but he's done these epic photo series called Genesis and maybe one other one. They're all about the oldest places on Earth and things in like the Galapagos Islands or the oldest trees on Earth. And he's a very well-known photographer in the fine art photo realm. His work, I've seen it hanging in the United Nations. When I saw it at age 19, it was at the Joslin Art Museum in Omaha, Nebraska.
Can you articulate what about that art spoke to you?
He worked in black and white and he shot in large format, which are aesthetic choices. But if you can think of the 80s and like the Joshua Tree
Yeah.
photographs that Anton Corbijn did, and he also did all of Depeche Mode's art. He's primarily known for Joy Division, New Order, U2, and Depeche Mode. And then the Killers have used Anton Corbijn to do a lot of their photography because they're influenced by all the same stuff that I'm talking about at this
Yeah.
point. And the people that he featured in it were workers from around the world. So there were the ones I can remember off the top of my head that were really poignant. There's these people in a like a gold pit, and there's just thousands of people in it. They're digging gold or whatever they're mining. Smashing Pumpkins made a music video that extrapolated from that image, and it was Bullet with Butterfly Wings, I believe. There's people who were like turning off the oil wells that Saddam Hussein lit on fire in the first Iraq Kuwait war. And so you'd see like a schlubby American worker with a hard hat, and he's got a jet of water that's spraying over him, and he's walking into this giant inferno. And it's just, I could not imagine what it's like to just walk into a plume of fire coming out of an oil. There were shipbreakers in India, and these were people who were barefoot, but they had sledgehammers, and their job was to break up commercial ships and take the scrap metal and sell it. And then there was a slaughterhouse in South Dakota, and you'd see a lot of people work in slaughterhouses or migrants or from Latin America, and they would have blood up to their waist, and that was like a function of their job. And it's all very punchy stuff, and there's never a Sebastian Salgado photo that celebrates like celebrity or excess.
Yeah.
There's a lot of photographers I like that do all sorts of portraits. Richard Avedon famously was well known for his celebrities and politicians, people like Marilyn Monroe, Eisenhower, and he was a person who navigated the New York elite, but he came out to the American West and he photographed these carnival workers and people who were covered in bees or something like that. Also black and white imagery. So I do black and white stuff like that myself. I thought at the beginning of my career I would be more of a National Geographic type photographer, and that didn't happen.
Yeah.
Because like I said, I also grew up in the 80s and all that pop culture stuff. That was like imaginative and dreamlike. Film directors beyond the sci-fi ones, but people like Guillermo del Toro and David Lynch and that stuff interested me as much as anything else. What I had developed into, at least in the photo world, is more with art models. And there are people who you can come up with a concept that and maybe get like a location and a hair and makeup artist and do something. One of the photographers that I studied under, his name is Frank Ockenfels III, and he is a former Rolling Stone photographer. He does everything for Breaking Bad and Mad Men and all the Walking Dead shows, all the AMC shows. And he worked a lot with David Bowie. I know he shot Bruce Springsteen. I think it was around Devils and Dust or Tom Joad, one of those eras. And I've navigated in between those worlds. My mentor was Sally Mann's assistant, my mentor at ASU.
Yeah.
And since moving to Los Angeles, it's funny because I have like 15 years of art model stuff under my belt. And when I moved here about 2.5 years ago, I'm like, I guess it's going to be all the time. And it didn't end up being that way. I shoot less art models now, but I developed more of shooting bands because it's easier to go to shows and have either my digital camera or I take a lot of disposable ones with me because I really like the aesthetic of bright flash, chaos in a concert, and disposable cameras are like little cheap plastic ones.
Sure.
And I live down the street from a punk club. The Subhumans and the Adverts were two of the punk bands that I've shot recently. And I had the digital and I had the disposable, but I really loved what I got out of the disposable because when I scan them, I tape my film down to the screen and I leave in all the sprockets and the dust and cat hair and
Yeah.
whatever. It just feels a lot more authentic to what you might have seen from the 1970s and CBGBs and Blondie and the
Yeah.
Ramones and that era.
You talked about growing up, and so I want to switch for a minute and talk about music. What kind of music were your family listening to, and what were you listening to as you grew up?
My parents divorced at age 5, so I don't know that much about my dad's
Okay.
music collection. I absolutely recall him having the 4 record set or 4 tape set, whatever it was at the time of Bruce Live.
Okay.
And I think my first concert as a little kid was John Denver, who
I do too. I
he
think
did
it's a shame he is not in the Country Music Hall of Fame or the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And there was a time when he was incredible. He still is. His music, I had a lot of joy listening to it. So I absolutely get you.
he hosted the Tonight Show. That's how big he was in pop culture. And I went into a deep John Denver phase. And I was listening to like Prisoners and For Bobby and looking for space. And
Yeah.
there's concepts behind these things. They're not all just soft rock of its era.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he should be a lot more celebrated. I'll get to my favorite folk artist
Okay.
shortly. That wasn't how I grew up, but around the house, I think the Monkees was on Nickelodeon. So I
Sure.
watched this show and I was like, these songs are amazing and this show is funny and I like these characters. And
Yeah.
then I had an older sister, 3 years older than me, so she had all the cool stuff. And my first adult music was probably Faith No More, Epic. So the album was the real thing, and then I really got into that. The first purchases I made on my with my allowance money would have been rap albums like LL Cool J and Salt and Pepper.
Yeah.
Then as I grew into my teen years and really picked up on cool music, I got into the English scene that was mixing rock and sampling and hip hop and techno. So the bands of that era would have been Jesus Jones, EMF, who I'm going to see shortly in a few months,
Yeah.
Pop Weight itself, Ned's Atomic Dustbin, The Wonder Stuff, and then extrapolating from that, like digging through my sister's collection, which I thought was cool. She always owned Depeche Mode and The Cure, but I took all of her U2 albums, and this would have been Optune Baby, Zooropa.
Yeah.
Still, although you could probably say U2 is my favorite well-known band, but
Yeah.
that particular era was just very vibrant to me. And then I don't shame them for not being as experimental as they would have been in their early 30s, but it definitely, when you look at when artists like really stretch outside of what they're known for and incorporate new technology and stuff, that attitude means a lot to me.
So one of the things I find interesting in our discussion already, David, is you seem to connect music to also the visual arts. You talked about videos, you talked about album covers. Was it always connected to you that way when you were growing up? Did you always think of music as visual?
Yeah, because it was MTV's era. In fact,
Sure.
it's funny whenever like industry changes, there was home taping was going to kill the industry, MTV was going to kill the industry, Napster killed the industry, the internet and Spotify killed the industry, AI is killing the industry, but it's like there still is something happening. It's always changing. You know, in the 60s it was the singles market and then it became an album market through the 70s. I know that growing up in the 80s having that visual component and then there's good and bad to that because if you got a really bad music video, it's hard to disassociate that with the song when you want to enjoy it on its own merits. But I think I like a lot of music that is visual anyways. I think I really love Nine Inch Nails and I went maybe 10 years not listening to it and then falling back in and digging through the archives. And one of the things that Trent talked about was when he would pick songs to make videos and release singles, he usually had a visual in mind. Or he described some songs like the lyrics aren't very visual, so they could be a little more abstract with the video or make it more performance based. They've had opinions about how to run their career, whether it was the Ticketmaster stuff or not making music videos and stuff. Always good for an artist to have an opinion on how to run their career and have things that they stand for. Maybe that's why I never connected to Pearl Jam.
When You mentioned in our discussion about really being enjoying Bruce's social conscious, Ghost of Tom Joad, Devils in Dusk, Pete Seeger, you talked about other stuff. So can you remember when you first discovered the other side of Bruce? Because growing up when you did, right? 84, Born in the USA, that's everywhere. It's all over MTV. But can you remember when you discovered this deeper side of Bruce?
So the oddest Bruce Springsteen experience I had was tracks
Okay.
of all things. And my mom owned that. And I would have been probably like 21
Hmm.
around that time.
Yeah.
And I, of course, had been aware of him when I was really exploring music. And it would have been like the early 90s and U2. What Bruce had would have been like Brilliant Disguise or Streets of Philadelphia. I don't know what the Bruce community's consensus is at this time, but I think a lot of us would look at that when he got married to that model and he moved to LA.
Yeah.
Like that is a weird side quest
Yeah.
from where he came from, where he always has like his heart has been, and starting in the early 80s, right?
Yeah, during the Tunnel of Love. He had known her before, and she was too young when she first applied for the band. And so it was during the Tunnel of Love tour. So that was 86, 87, something along that line. And she became part of the band.
So I probably started with tracks because I was like, there's a lot of stuff here. And I think as soon as I hit my early 20s, I had the vision that if you picked an artist that had enough discography, because I was burning CDs, I was like, you can make one CD out of anybody that is the best thing you've ever heard in your life. Take Queen's entire discography, and there's a lot of Queen that I like and a lot that I think is just, I can't even believe they put it, the same band put that out and put out all this other
Yeah.
stuff. But if I just pick the top 18, I'm going to get something great. And one thing that kind of stopped me from really enjoying older music is I am also into production a lot.
Mhm.
And I do the 60s production that has texture to it and Motown and Wall of Sound and George
Sure.
Martin. And the 70s, it's not any band's fault. It's just that there's something about the production that doesn't seem, it's not as rich and it's not as textured. It falls in between somewhere to me. And so in the 90s, when people are mixing on SSL discs and they've really cranked up the dynamics of things like Nirvana, and it goes from soft to loud really quickly because of the way the music is produced and that it's on CDs. The 70s music just didn't do it for me. So when I got into tracks, there's the River era stuff. Take 'Em as They Come and Roulette and Living on the Edge of the World and Where the Bands Are. And I think Living on the Edge of the World was written for the Ramones, if I'm not mistaken. But that stuff sounds so good on tracks, but compared to the original 1980, 1979 recordings, there's just like night and day. Whoever cleaned it up, I don't know if it was Bob Clearmountain or um, whoever was involved. Like it's kind of like listening on Beatles anthology, even though those are like inferior versions of the real songs because of the way they were produced and cleaned up. They sound so good. And I can find stuff on Beatles anthology that I prefer far better than the things that they had to bounce down to. I don't even know what the maximum number of tracks would have been in 1968, but they had a limit and they always had to shove everything in a way that kind of like trashed parts of the song. After tracks, it would have been Ghost of Tom Joad, backtracking. And then when I moved to Arizona in 2003, I went to the Mesa Public Library. You could check out stuff. And I saw this CD by not Bruce Springsteen, but a different artist. And it was called I Ain't Marching Anymore. The artist is Phil Ochs. And so he is genuinely if someone was to say, who's your favorite artist, pure artist, I would say Phil Ochs.
Yeah.
His entire life is very inspiring to me. He is a social crusading artist who also understood that this is real. This isn't
Yeah.
just you writing a song and then putting it out and then living your lavish rock and roll lifestyle. This isn't something that you just clock out of. He wanted art that would like destroy him to the point where he destroyed himself, but that was also inherited issues from the family. He would go around the world. He would meet with Victor Jara in, I'm forgetting what country Victor Jara is from, Venezuela or Argentina. But he was a folk singer down there who ultimately like was killed in a soccer stadium by the regime. And Phil did art that was like really boundary pushing when he got to Pleasures of the Harbor album and Tape from California. So in the last 6 or 7 years, I did an animated film on Phil Ochs. I took all these like YouTube clips of his interviews and talking about his life and also the scene and his opinion on like drugs and psychedelics and how Nixon administration just all they had to say is you don't have to like me, but I'm a normal guy, and you're gonna have these drooling in the mouth hooligans in the streets with these weird lefties, and they're all on drugs. Vote for me because at least I'm you can trust me around your children or something like that. And I stitched all that together as a narrative. I bookended it with this really sad audio where Phil was like clearly drunk and it was towards the end of his life. He was faking an identity called John Train. And I had a program that was new at the time called Character Animators from Adobe, and you can make motion capture puppets. So even this conversation we're having, we could have a live animated version of me that's talking to you right now.
Oh, interesting.
It's- yeah, not too different from an emoji, but more sophisticated
Hmm.
than that. And so I did that project, and it's 14 minutes long. It's on my YouTube channel, and it has a lot of the inside stories, like Bob Dylan kicking Phil out of a limousine for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Then I last year I was learning about Suno, the AI music generator. My son was visiting. He was going on a tirade against AI in general because Julian Casablancas from The Strokes had put out an album that clearly had AI art and had AI influence in the music. And my son is 18, and I was like, not everything about this can be bad because I've heard so much in my life that sampling is bad, Spotify is bad, streaming is bad, and that's what's being said about AI right now. Drum
Yeah,
machines are
it's
bad.
that
So
this is what's going to destroy. Oh, wait a minute. I know this didn't destroy, right? I mean,
yeah, Pro
and
Tools.
yeah,
And the truth is, as much as people hem and haw about new technology, or we are like concerned because just like the Industrial Revolution and other digital revolution, it's going to change things in a way that causes massive layoffs. We know that's true, but that doesn't change that it's here. And also anything that people are like, let's garbage. Somebody clever picks up a sampler, a drum machine, streaming the YouTube channels. They figure out how to communicate their ideas, and they were usually somebody who could not have done it before. They were gate kept somehow. You didn't live in the right city, you didn't live in the right country, you didn't know how to play an instrument, but you learned how to mix two records together to make a new sound, and then somebody who couldn't sing can now rhyme over it. So I went on this experiment. I'm like, I'm going to start messing with AI music, but the way I'm going to do it is I want to start with something really pure and also something that's like obscure. And so I cut up some Phil Oakes songs and started feeding them into Suno. I think a lot of the good music of any genre was in like the early experimental phase, and then the later period when people got rid of all the boundaries.
got you. I understand
Not
what you're
when
saying.
it's not when it's really codified, like what a rock band is and what you have these players and they do these things. I like when they are either very early. So Elvis is a somebody I really like, probably because Bruce likes her.
Yeah,
But I have my Elvis phase, and then I've mentioned a lot of bands that use samplers and keyboards and cross pollinate their genres. One of the early bands I really liked that was an electronic duo is the Future Sound of London. They're very abstract, and they came along with Aphex Twin and Meepy Manifesto and things like that. And I had always thought about what if Phil Oakes and John Denver had lived long enough to get remixed into this kind of abstract trip hop ambient material. And so
yeah.
that's what I did. it was in September or October of last year with Phil Ochs, and I put it out as like a 40-minute mega mix thing on my YouTube channel. And I feel comfortable doing it with Phil because there is no more new Phil Ochs product. And I think that you see this with artists who have passed away and but still have large followings. Even I think it's Sean Lennon is talking about how now that he's taken control of John Lennon's legacy, he's going to be experimental
Yeah.
because he wants to see those ideas continue. There's good and bad ways to do that, of course. And they're trying to put James Dean into movies with AI and things.
Yeah.
That sounds a little ghastly. But by the same token, we get new iterations of stories, maybe the last movie I saw that I really enjoyed was Nosferatu.
Yeah.
That's just a retelling of Dracula. That's a retelling of Murnau film from 100 years ago. And that was a bootleg of Dracula. So I think ideas continuing on and influences continuing on the respectful way to do it.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting. Are you familiar with Phil? His songs?
No, I'm not.
Oh, it would be a good deep dive.
Okay.
His first set of records are entirely just acoustic guitar with an occasional piano. And he was a topical singer in that era. The equivalent would be Bruce's Nebraska,
Okay.
essentially, but a little bit faster and with more fury. And some of those songs I was able to translate into Celtic punk. So instead of being just a man and an acoustic guitar, it's entirely rewritten new melodies, but it has his voice. And now it sounds like the Pogues. And as AI is getting better and better, when you
Yeah.
define what you want, like if I wanted to make a photograph, I could define the type of camera, the type of film, the type of shot, everything within it. And you realize it will only be a couple of years before somebody could, maybe like a team of 7 people could recreate Lord of the Rings if they could articulate it enough. And they could do it within a week.
Yeah.
Like it's not impossible. You can just remix the past into the future. Clever people are going to make some really amazing art and they're going to be able to do it all around the world, even if they're somebody who's been wheelchair bound all their life. I've never had the option to be a rock rap star can now be that through this technology.
That's fascinating. I have mixed emotions like everyone. And one of the things that I had struggled with is editing my podcast because I just did not have the 3 hours to go through listening to our discussion and go, oh, let me delete that, delete
Yeah.
that.
And there's automated tools for that right now.
And so I picked up the script and all of a sudden I upload the audio, it transcribes it for me. And if you right click it and it says, do you want me to get rid of all the filler words? Yes. And it just, okay, they're done. And I'm
Mhm.
like, holy crap. Tools are used to help us create art. Tools don't have a moral. They're not good tools and bad tools. They're tools. And
Right.
depending on how you use them, can change on how they're used, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
I know that those tools are useful for us, even like learning more about ourselves. Not
Yeah.
everything has to be a mashup of what I've described up to this point,
Yeah.
but I YouTube a lot that some of it's about technology and some of it's about business of being an artist and some of it's about like the interior artist life or the INFP personality. But it's been a lot of years that I've been YouTubing and I know Premiere could automatically transcribe stuff. So I took 10 hours of my YouTubes, fed it into Premiere, got the scripts, took those, went to Claude, which is a really good AI. I recommend it over ChatGPT and other ones. And that was recommended to me by Seth Godin, who's a well-known business guru who
Okay.
happens to be like very empathetic and creative in what he does. And I fed these transcripts into Claude. I said, in my own words, can you like pick out what themes are? What I wrote a book last year about Procreate Dreams, which is a animation app from
Mhm.
Procreate. And I've got the bug. I think I can crank out a book a year, but as you mentioned, it's a lot of time.
Yeah.
And what we really are doing as creative people is like gathering all this raw material and then figuring out how to chisel it into something presentable.
Yeah.
You can't just gather raw material and do nothing with it. But the chiseling part is why David Lynch took 5 years to make Eraserhead. Took it was so much effort to get money to shoot what basically had a few actors, and it cost him so much of his life. The same with other filmmakers. Guillermo del Toro's first movie was 8 years long.
Yeah.
And these people are almost driven to madness or drugs or lose their family and their homes. It doesn't have to be like that anymore. I took 10 hours of my transcript. I said, can you organize this into themes that I repeat, things that are a little more like practical and things that are a little more esoteric? And essentially, it took a day, but I got 80 pages of a book, first draft, out of things I've already done. I've already said it. And it's all in my own words. Out of 10 years of my life, I'm sorry, 10 hours that were good enough for me to finish, record, release on YouTube, and that I had the metrics of what was successful as a release and what wasn't.
Yeah.
You could imagine, I don't know if we think of artists who have a big archive like Prince or Bruce Springsteen or Bob Dylan, and you could just feed it into the machine. You don't have to just take the results and then say, there it is, all done, but feed it, see it, what happens. Feed it into the machine. You'll find out what could be a good first draft of a book that you can then bang into shape. You could find out where, you know, how a lot of songs are like half finished and they get welded to other songs to become the
Yeah.
finished product. You could say, let's say Bruce has 1,000 songs in an archive, and or which of these have seem like they could be thematically linked, and the AI will do that, and then he can listen to it and decide whether it's good or bad. But that's essentially what somebody like Brian Eno is doing right now. He's been a long advocate for generative art, and so his main concern is more about who owns the technology, which is always in the hands of a certain few tech overlords who are not like the most empathetic or well-meaning people in the world. And I think about that and I'm like, what you all this technology that I'm using, all this Apple stuff, it comes from a place and then you use it and you turn it into something else as an artist, and you can be subversive, or
Yeah.
you can also participate, which is not a bad thing.
Yeah.
I was sponsored briefly by Adobe for 5 years, and there's a lot of complaints people have about Adobe with their subscription plan, and maybe it's very difficult to cancel without getting a big consequence. But there's good things about it too, and the tools are that you're paying for. If you take your art and craft seriously, you'll figure out how to make it into something good, I think.
Yeah.
You'll put it to a good end. And if it is something that's too expensive or you hate the ownership of that tool, then you shouldn't have a dark night of the soul about leaving a piece of technology, because the
Yeah.
truth is there's other options. It's not the
Yeah.
only.
I hear you. David, what haven't you done creatively that you will still want to? It sounds like you've worked with your art, you've done animation, you've written a book. What is something that's still on your to-do list, or there's an itch you want to scratch?
I want to make a feature length film. I want to do a narrative one that has actors, and I can tell you the vibe I'm going for, and where I live is a unique place. So I live in San Pedro, which is the bottom LA harbor area.
Okay.
I'm very removed from what people think of with Hollywood sign and downtown LA. I live in cliffs and fog, and it's 10 degrees colder here. And our well-known celebrity is Charles Bukowski. So that's who lived in San Pedro. And Palos Verdes is up on a hill and it's mansions. So it literally is the mansion on the hill with people who are into real estate. They're not movie moguls, as far as I know. And actually, a lot of that is erosion is causing the cliffs to fall. And so these billion-dollar homes are like shattering in the middle
Mm,
right now. And I think I've seen San Pedro in a few movies. It's in The Big Lebowski where they scatter Steve Buscemi's ashes, but it's very unique here and it's also dreamy. So I thought about kind of like a shoegaze type of film. And I've researched like what kinds of films are close to that. You have Drive, which has from 2013. I really like that one, but it has more of an 80s cyberpunk, but not punky. It's just very retro 80s and it's not dreamy in a feminine way. And then you have the genuine films of that era, which would be John Hughes, which I don't really rate as being like particularly artistic. They're very commercial. Your 16 Candles and that kind of thing. So I think there's room for that kind of film. A lot of the art models I work with are of that personality where they're almost like ethereal beings and ethereal artist beings who are really bad at paying bills and
Yeah.
living life, but they're just consumed by their imagination. Those of us who can get careers in it are far and few between, but they're like the celebrated people of Miyazaki or David Lynch.
Okay.
And I also want to make a documentary film about a lot of what I've been talking about, where there's a continuum of creativity, whether it's Pete Seeger recycling folk melodies that influence these other generations or sampling and bootleg toys. I think collage is not only a valid way of creating, I think it's, if we were honest about who we are and what we make and what we celebrate as original works, we would realize it's all synthesized and collage from existing elements anyways. And that's what makes it original is Bruce Springsteen loves Elvis, but he grows up in a different time than Elvis and he writes his own songs and he's from New Jersey and he's never worked in a factory a day in his life, but he's propelled to tell those stories over selling himself as like a rock god
Yeah.
or as like the when Bob Dylan was political, he might paint himself as part Messiah or something.
Yeah.
And Bruce never, he only did that out of humor. He never did that as like, he didn't have that ego.
Mm.
And so he comes out as like a unique being that, for being an East Coast urbanite guy, really speaks to the heartland. And then he's curious about Grapes of Wrath. And it all came from someplace.
Yeah.
And my favorite filmmaker, Guillermo del Toro, he made a Pinocchio movie. He made a few comic book movies for The Blade and Hellboy. He made a movie about the creature from the Black Lagoon. His next movie is Frankenstein. He
Yeah.
made Pacific Rim and Crimson Peak are from their genres. Nightmare Alley was a book. So I think there's a good documentary in there that can weave in all of that stuff, but also be told with archival footage, AI generated video, sampling, interviews,
Yeah.
just cut it together in a really interesting way. So the film itself is an art product. This is a big stretch, but if you've ever seen like Samsara or kind of Squatsy or one of those films where it's like just incredible visuals and maybe the story is a little more abstract.
Okay.
That's what I really want to make.
Did what should I have asked you that I haven't?
Oh man, it is the Bruce cast.
Yes.
Talk about-
Have you seen Bruce perform live?
No, I've never. The few times that he came around Phoenix, and I think he had an LA show since I lived here, unless it was
Yeah.
part of the ones that were canceled. But I've never been able to get together the scratch when he came. Also, it's this is so funny, but I don't have anybody to go with to
Yeah.
Bruce.
I usually preface that question with the amount of times you've seen Bruce is not a fair barometer of how big of a fan you are, because there are people that are huge fans that have never had a chance to see him. I love how you're combining your love of music and your love of art and also your social conscience to present your vision of the world. And I think that's really nice.
Thank you. I have a weird favorite era of him. Like you asked me about Thunder Road. I know that's one of the upcoming questions.
Yeah.
Much like Blink 182, all the
Yeah.
early popular stuff, I've listened to it once or twice. And that's blasphemy to many people.
Yeah.
But there's always going to be something that connects with you more. Bruce, circa 9/11, with The
Yeah.
Rising, and then Magic and Working on a Dream. And I know Devils and Dust was in between there. Not so much that one, but when the E Street Band reunited, and
Yeah.
then Brendan O'Brien started producing them. It sounded so modern, and he was
Yeah.
using Pro Tools. So you had things like the song "Diffuse" has a actual hip hop beat in it. Or
Yeah.
you get to Wrecking Ball and there's a lot more, I don't know if you call it sampling, but there's definitely a lot more modern production techniques.
Hmm.
We'll And he, besides incorporating that stuff with Brendan, he was also incorporating more Celtic punk
Yeah.
stuff. And he was bringing more of like the Joe Strummer influence. So you get to Wrecking Ball with American Land and spacing some of the other songs that have
Yeah.
Easy Money, Shackled and Drawn. I love all of that stuff. And I think the last one that had that vibe was The High Hopes. That was a compilation, but it had the Tom Morello tracks.
Yeah.
Tom Morello, there's another artist who, like, I'll say all these great things about him. I've never listened to a Rage Against the Machine record ever. And how does that not align when I talk about Nine Inch Nails and Faith No More and all this? I don't know. It just never happened. But I've listened to Tom Morello's solo stuff. He definitely is followed in the footsteps of folky, progressive, politically minded artists, people who walk the walk and talk the talk.
Yeah.
Really love the version of Tom Joad that he did. And then there's a few other tracks on, I think, is it Frankie Fell in Love?
Yeah.
So besides being more modern sounding and reinvigorated, I think of things like Gypsy Biker or Frankie Fell in Love or I'll Work for Your Love on Magic.
Yeah.
Those are just full of energy and really vibrant to me. I think there's a part in Gypsy Biker where the all the guitar and the synth, whatever it is, it's blending together. It's almost like a soupy mix, like something Daniel
Yeah.
Lanois would do with U2. And I get such like a rush on it. I also think that the topics of like specifically regarding Iraq and 9/11, when Bruce wrote songs, one, nobody else was, and by that time, people weren't political in their art anymore. It's so funny because we didn't really have any major wars in the 90s, barring the 6 month Gulf War, but there
Yeah.
wasn't a whole lot going on. And the musicians were so political, probably because it was convenient. And
Yeah.
then when you had something like the Dixie Chicks being embarrassed about George Bush and then losing a lot of record sales, like
Yeah.
people shut up and they've continued to shut up. But Bruce on The Rising, he'll have a song like Paradise, which is from the point of view of a suicide bomber, or the song Rising itself. I listened to it a ton last year and I was really trying to decipher what was happening in that song. And I think that it is a rescue worker burning to death and then going to heaven, like through the course of the song. They're entering in a hell that they know they're not going to get out of, and they do die in the middle of the song. And then when it gets a little more transcendent and ambient is when they're ascending. And I think, man, like who else is writing anything remotely this meaningful these days? And it shows that you could take any pivotal moment in culture or life in general and look at it from different angles. Empty Sky is a different angle than Counting on a Miracle, and a different angle from Paradise or Worlds Apart, which has the, I don't know if it's Sufi or Sunni Islamic singing in it,
Yeah.
but it's pretty, I don't know, it's fascinating. And I love that about Bruce. I'm trying to think of other people off the top of my head. There's probably filmmakers like Martin Scorsese who are good at this, where they're going to investigate characters. They're not going to apologize for what happens with the characters in the story, but they're digging deep into what it is that motivates people and their stories. It doesn't have to be a story you like.
Yeah.
Loose Change, which is not on any of those albums, but it's off of Tracks. That's one of those stories about it would fit in if it wasn't so synth heavy. It would fit in really well with Ghost of Tom Joad, where it's like a drifter and their experience and how like fleeting their romantic encounters are. That it's a metaphor with loose change and
Yeah.
leaving town.
When I think there are certainly fans who love the other stuff and feel like he peaked on Darkness, right? If I had a choice between hearing a concert that started with Tunnel of Love going forward or going from Darkness and backwards, I would pick Tunnel of Love forward going because they hear the songs from Magic and The Rising, Wrecking Ball, Letter to You, Western Stars. When you think about that in the sports analogy, he still has a fastball, right? That he's still creating interesting music that has something to say. And I just think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and it's helpful when you can look at an artist and not be embarrassed by their,
Yeah,
John Lennon, everything John Lennon happened before I was even conscious of music, but
right.
there would have been a point where early 70s, you would have been embarrassed to be a John Lennon fan when he's getting like he's with the Hollywood vampires and getting thrown out of clubs. And
Yeah.
Bruce has had one DUI or DWI.
Yeah, in fact, it was interesting because when you heard that, there was all kinds of, and it turned out like he was riding his motorcycle and it was a national park, and fans said, "Hey, take a shot with us, take a shot. Biden has won." And so he did one shot, maybe two. And so it was just barely over the legal limit. And the biggest issue was that he actually drank on a national park, which is against the law.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah, in fact, he joked about that. The United States versus Bruce Springsteen. He says, when you've got a whole country against you. And so he ended up getting a fine. And he joked about, yes, I can pay the fine. So it was because it was like under $1,000. I mean, I'm sure he's been very open about his depression. And I found that fascinating because I think all of us have had our own struggles in him sharing that.
Yeah. And maybe Pete Seeger was this too, where somebody found the thing they were meant to do. They've done it
Yeah.
well. They've been a good mentor to the following generations.
Yeah. And there's this, he, down south, I was raised in the South where, and there's one of the nicest compliments you can give, and one of the worst insults is he forgot where he came from. When someone forgot where they came from, an insult. And Bruce never seemed to forget where he came from. I think he recognizes those that came in before him and seems to be still exploring new music and likes that, which I think is wonderful. Yeah.
I know he did a thing with Bleachers. Dustland was like a redo of a Killer song that he guested on,
Yeah.
but obviously like the sound of a lot of the Killers music is because of the influence of Bruce. But Brandon Flowers is the same personality type as me, and he's religious and he looks for. I'm not that different, to be honest. I'm not Mormon, but the artists that I really like are the ones that have a pure vision. It doesn't mean they only worked with pure tools or something like that, but the art was always the most important thing. So the opposite of me would be like Motley Crue.
Yeah.
Whereas maybe music was first, but drugs and women and all that stuff, I understand how people like the trappings of being famous, but like I don't want to support, if I have to support people with my time and my money and my energy and also be influenced by them, I really just think that like creativity is part of what God is. And when we
Yeah.
serve the creative energy and the flow, those of us who were meant for this sort of thing, we're doing it right. And all the other things that are like desirable functions of life come, but you cannot just be like Gene Simmons from Kiss or something like that's just talk
Yeah.
about money and all the time. Funnily enough, Outlaw Pete being a sort of like a redo of a Kiss song.
Yeah.
I enjoy Outlaw Pete a lot. I don't remember the Kiss song, that disco-y one.
Yeah.
So Bruce, and he's closer to the end of his life, obviously, than anything else.
Yeah.
Jon Stewart, whenever he talks about Bruce Springsteen, he had him on the end of the Daily Show. He did Land of Hope
Right.
and Dreams, but
Yeah.
they're similar people
Yeah.
where they aren't naive about the world, and they're not like painting us pretty pictures about how great everything is. It's just they are rising to the challenge of whatever are the dark forces or the forces of negativity or the forces that say art isn't worth anything or it can't be about people who aren't pretty and glamorous or that the only way to deal with absurd news is just tell jokes in a Jimmy Fallon kind of way.
Yeah.
No, you can be a real person. It doesn't have to eat your soul. That's probably what I think stops a lot of people because they think just the onslaught of life.
Yeah.
Funny when the eras that you and I have lived through, and we're like, oh, this is rough. What is it like to live in World War II? You know,
Yeah, exactly.
any country in the world and during World War II, we had our president on his fourth term who had married his cousin who was probably in a lesbian relationship with a reporter, and our president had his secretary and had polio and rescued us from the Great Depression. We're fighting forces that are killing levels of genocide today. We're talking like 50,000 people or 100,000 people, but in that time, 80 million people, 100 million people. It's impossible to think of. So, yeah, I love Bruce.
Yeah, I got it. All right. Do you think Mary gets in the car at the end of Thunder Road?
My answer is no. And from a life experience point of view, you will never have everything all at once.
Yeah.
And by that, the relationship you want, the career you want,
Yeah.
a happy ending, money.
Yeah.
There is no time when all the ducks will line up in a row. And everybody who's wise and old that I know, like Steve Harvey,
Yeah.
they say the same thing. And it's a naive early 20s romantic view. I know why people believe in it because we have to think there's a point to all of this and that we're all progressing to that apex where all the ducks will come together and everything's going to be great. But a boy leaving town to pursue his music has hard choices and he's going to have to leave something and the girl will not go with him. Also, this is a not an indictment of Bruce or anybody else who tells these kind of stories, but I do not think that if you look at like the history of movies and songs and romantic stuff, so many times the female character is just in support of the male character, the protagonist male's dreams. And so we would watch all these movies in the 80s where like the goal was that you got the girl and you saved you got the money, the gold, whatever it was in
Yeah.
Goonies. I just don't think that story wise, it's going to work out. And I would appreciate the story to be honest that way because my dreams to be the artist that I want, I was married, 20-year relationship, have a family, is still in Arizona. But you know what? There was a point where for all that I'm doing to work, after 20 years slugging it out in Nebraska and Arizona, like I had to personally make a choice. And that choice did not bring along the family and the wife. So I think that's, and now living in Los Angeles and realizing that all those successful people that you see in movies and that actually have like recording careers and stuff, they lost everything to get that. Unless they were a Nepo supported kind of artist,
Yeah.
if they came from a completely a lineage like Drew Barrymore or somebody who she suffered too, but unless they were 100% supported by a system of who they already knew, they lost and sacrificed every single thing that you can think of to get to that level of their art reaching you.
Yeah.
So maybe it won't be like that in an AI era. And the reason why it has to be that way too is because if you are a person who stops yourself, suppresses yourself,
Yeah.
okay, I'm gonna work as hard as I can in my art, but my wife comes home at 9 o'clock and I'm just gonna stop and be present for her. Guess what? There's somebody who doesn't stop at 9 o'clock and they get it and they continue. You can only achieve so much if you stop yourself, if you say, I'm going to be uncomfortable with my family members, my loved ones, or my job or other elements of life. That's going to be uncomfortable for me, so I'm not going to go that far. It's the prize always belongs to the athletes who go beyond when it's uncomfortable for them.
Okay, there you
He's
go.
gonna, he has to live with it.
All right, I love it. If someone wants to reach you, how can they?
My studio name is Primordial Creative, and I'm at Primordial Creative on YouTube and Instagram.
This has been so interesting. Any final thoughts?
I looked forward to this so much. I'm not sure if Bruce Springsteen is something that comes to mind when people find my stuff, but if you end up following me for maybe more than a week, I'll start talking about the Killers and U2, and then Bruce is not far behind at all. But I think he's a stellar example to not just like musicians, but all kinds of artists who are trying to figure out how to live their life. I think actually that's what Brandon Flowers, the Killer, said when he discovered Bruce. This is how you live it. This is how you survive it. Is you be this guy who's always grateful and never forgets where he came from.
Yeah, I think said. My friend, this was a blast. You're welcome anytime, David. Anytime you want to discuss,
Oh, sure.
we'd
Maybe
love
we'll
to
do
have.
live on the
That sounds good. All right, listeners, check out the website, check out the art. For now, remember to be safe, be kind, and we'll talk to you soon. Goodbye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Set Lusting Bruce. I hope you enjoyed it, and I also hope you check out other episodes of the podcast. I'm going to go through some housekeeping items here on how to contact me and some of my other projects, so please hang around. I'm still on Twitter, aka X, at Jesse Jackson DFW. The show is also on Twitter at Set Lusting Bruce. I and the show have a Facebook page. Please go there and like us. I'm part of a few other podcasts. On Perfectly Good Podcast, me and my co host Sylvan are talking about every John Hyatt song in alphabetical order. Set Lusting Bruce and Perfectly Good Podcast are part of the Pantheon Podcast Network, where we have hundreds of shows dedicated to music. Please check them out. My good friend Charles and I continue to talk all things Doctor Who on Next Stop Everywhere. Lou, Karen, and I talk about pulp culture topics on the JKL Media Podcast. I would love to hear your feedback. Please send me an email to setlustingbruce@gmail.com. You can leave a voicemail, 469-249-2442. Go to iTunes to rate and review any of the podcasts I'm on, and we will read them on the show. Please tell me what you like, tell me what you dislike. Hook me up with someone you think would be a great guest. Getting to talk to people about their experiences, whether it be music or other creative endeavors, is my passion. And I hope these conversations bring you a little joy, a little peace, and a whole lot of love. Keep hope alive.
There's a joke here somewhere, it's on me. Shake this world off my shoulders.